So, my presentation is called Your Path is Your Path, from local journalism to the New York Times. My name is Claudio Cabrera. I am the I specialize in SEO at the New York Times, and I am director of audiences. I was born in New York, but my parents are from the Dominican Republic. I've been working for over 10 years in SEO at small brands and brands like CBS and now the New York Times, where I've been for 4 years. I've worked as a professor at different universities, and I've been a consultant for different brands like El Diario in Venezuela, and Nuevo Dia in Puerto Rico, and La Tercera in Chile, among others. Well, a lot of people think that you have to that people think that you have to go to school, you have to go to Columbia or Northwestern to get to a place at the Times get to a place like the Times as a reporter. I never had the New York Times as a goal for myself because I thought that I had to have gone to certain schools to get a job there. And to this day, many of my colleagues went to those schools. And obviously, it's easier to think that the best journalists come from these schools that they attended. And so what's happened over many years is that, well, those newspapers continue to hire the same people from these places, and they don't offer opportunities to other people who are also skilled but didn't have the opportunity to attend schools like Columbia, Northwestern, USC, and Syracuse, just to give you a few examples. And at the same time, there are many that think that you have to work in these places to reach the Times. And so you have to work at the Wall Street Journal, or you have to work at the Washington Post or the LA Times. And there are many people who came from those organizations and are now working at the Times. But as a person who began in community journalism at the local level, I never imagined I would make it to the New York Times because I didn't think that I was exposed to editors or reporters that worked at those brands. The difference now is that journalism is not just writing. And so they might not consider you a classic journalist, but there are many people at the Times who have the same audiences and creating good content at the same time. For example, I work on the SEO team when there is a big news event or breaking news or something that we need to plan out as far as sports match or something. We consult with our team as far as what we can do. And so these ideas about content that could attract a big audience. And likewise, now, the difference between now and 20 or even 10 years before is that there are data journalists, visual journalists, or people who work in social media. There are video and photo journalists, among others. And the most important thing to understand there is that there aren't schools right now that are teaching people those skills or that have classes about all of this material. And so anybody right now can learn to do visual journalism or data journalism or something like SEO, which is what I do every day at the New York Times. So where did I go to school? I went to Westchester Community College and then Brooklyn College. And so I remember that when I started with this community college in Westchester, I wasn't happy because I had a bad image of that school. I thought that I had failed by ending up attending that school because I had an idea about community colleges that was not good. I didn't have a good image of those, but that was the best thing that could have happened to me because I received a quality education, and at the same time, I was steered toward journalism there. That's where I got my start in my journalism career, and I really had the opportunity to sort of have a reset. I was able to go there. I didn't have the pressure that I would have surely had if I had gone to a much bigger college. And after Westchester Community College, I went to Brooklyn College, which is another big journalism school here in New York. And the most important thing is that I didn't have to pay as many student loans as other people did. But at the same time, I was given opportunities there that I might not have gotten other places. And so those opportunities were with community outlets. For example, I worked with New York Amsterdam News, which is one of the historically African American newspapers here in the United States. In Harlem, I also worked for the Riverdale Press, which is a newspaper in the Bronx, and I also worked for the Manhattan Times, which is a bilingual newspaper in Upper Manhattan, where I grew up. And likewise, when I left those newspapers, I started my career at a company called Interactive One. Interactive One is a digital content company that is focused on the African American community. And the same thing happened with Black Enterprise, which is a historic magazine here in the United States, whose focus is finance. And I also worked for the Black Star News at that same time, which is another community newspaper. And at that time, I was able to get a lot of experience that I don't think I was going to get at that time, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, at a much bigger brand, let's say. And so let's talk about the imposter syndrome. This was something that I felt intensely in college when I would go to journalism conferences during college. I was in a room where there simply weren't a lot of people who looked like me. And besides, there were many people who had done internships in all of the great places I've talked about, like the New York Daily News, the New York Post, the Times. But the change for me was when I asked those same people from all of those places how many articles they had written. The majority of them told me 0, because at that time, when you had an internship, you know, it was going to be extremely hard to publish an article in the Journal or the Times. But since I was working for community newspapers at that time, I wrote during my junior and senior year of college, I wrote almost 80 to 100 newspapers. And so I had experience that they didn't have, and I also had the opportunity to grow as a reporter. So at the New York Times, I had the same experience when I started. I thought that I wasn't going to last at the Times. I was always wondering, why did they hire me? I thought I wasn't going to succeed there. I think, that happens to a lot of people when they start a new job. I basically forgot about everything I had done that had gotten me to the Times, and I forgot that they sought me out for the job. This wasn't something that I had sought out, nor did I submit an application. And so what I'm trying to explain is don't reject community newspapers. Those newspapers have opportunities and can open doors that many large newspapers can't. And so during my time in local community journalism, I won an Independent Press Association prize. I helped to change a law in New York State with my coverage. I had opportunities that, like I said, many journalism students don't have in college. I did coverage of the 2005 mayor's race between Bloomberg and Fernando Ferrer. And as a basketball fanatic, I also had the opportunity to write about the Knicks and then go to games. Among them for baseball and basketball. At the same time, I think that my story is not common. There are not a lot of newspapers that historically look for people that have worked in spaces where I have worked, but big newspapers like the Times, I think, are changing in terms of their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, because they understand that they can't only have people working there from California or New York, or people who are coming from the Journal or the Washington Post, or who are from a certain family or studied at some Ivy League school. So they're understanding that they not only need racial or gender diversity, but also diversity in terms of people's background and experiences. The last thing that I'm going to offer as a piece of advice to work at the Times, and I'm saying this because I have friends who work at the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. Generally, when you have a cover letter, 2 years ago, I was in charge of reading 500 applications at the Times and reviewing them for our fellowship. And one of the most important things for the Times in any position, so in the cover letter, you should not only talk about why you want to work at the Times, or, talk about how you read the Times when you were young, but they also want to know something about you, something personal. And so it doesn't have to be about politics, but for example, if you were an editor at your school newspaper, or if you were a volunteer, if you played some sport in college, whatever you put into your cover letter at the New York Times, think about your story, your life, and what you would include in the movie of your life. And so that you might want to include the most important moments from your life that you think are applicable not necessarily to the position, but to the company that you're applying for at that time. I also think that it's very important to have a PowerPoint for your interview. You should understand three things. There are people who might be applying for that, who have connections at that company. And third, there are people who are going to apply and receive priority because they're already working there if they're a lateral transfer. So what I recommend is that when you're in that interview, you can give a PowerPoint slideshow that might take 30 minutes or 45 minutes to put together. That would only be 3 or 4 slides, but that explains what you would offer or bring to bear at the company in terms of what the company does well, and then an idea for them as well. As I see it, that's something that I look for in the interviews that I do for my team. And at the same time, I've seen a lot of people at the Times do that as well. They're looking for something extra that you could bring to bear or offer to be able to look at your interest level in that.
And so to avoid this imposter syndrome, when you get to a company, the most important thing you can do, seems to me, is every person you talk to, if there's a team in that company, you talk to somebody and find out if they can give you the name of somebody that you could talk to. And then when you talk to that person, ask them for 3 other people. In the first 2 months at the New York Times, I must have sat down to have coffee with about 40 people, 15 minutes at a time, and I talked to a whole bunch of people. And what that did for me was it helped me sort of get my footing and understand what different people's background, their stories were, how they came in to work at that company. Each person I talked to, I was able to learn something from. And so for me, this really helped me shaping my approach to working there every day. If you want, send me an email at claudio.cabrera@newyorktimesnytimes.com, and my Twitter account is right there. That's all. So I'll open this up to questions now, and if you have a question. One of the questions that I'm hearing just now is, what can somebody do to get to work at the New York Times if they're not going to ever have a chance to show their PowerPoint? I think what's needed to make it into a job like this is you have to have a social media presence. You don't necessarily have to have a certain number of followers in Twitter and Instagram, but you have to have the ability to see how social networks work. I think that's the most important thing. And the most important thing is to show what you're able to do in the line of work. If you're a reporter, you want to be able to show what journalism you've already done. It's important also to show LinkedIn, to use LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn was the way where the Times found me and sent me a message to work at the Times. So if you can uh, do your networking on LinkedIn and on Twitter at the same time, I think, as I already said, the most important thing you can do is the work you're doing wherever you're working now to always be like promoting your work and social networks in a way that is, creative to catch the eye of people working at the company that you'd like to work at. The next question that I see, can you talk to us specifically about the work you're doing at the Times and how is the work changing? So I'm the search engine optimization manager for reporters, editors at the Times using tools like Twitter, Google Trends, Crowd Trends, looking every day to see what is trending in the world, not only in the United States, but also globally, and sending those ideas to editors and saying, there are 1,000 people looking for this term, or there are 100,000 looking for this issue, and they're able to decide at that point with that information if they want to do a certain coverage on a certain subject area. For example, when the fires happened in California, the wildfires, they were not necessarily writing about that, but I was giving recommendations every day about the searches that people were putting in to find out how the fires had gotten started and where the fires were located in California to find out if the fires were near them or not. So my work is not only optimizing our content every day, but at the same time to recommend things not only for today, but for a longer range. Students are going to go back to school in September, and so I'll be connecting next month with that section to find out what they're going to be doing as of today. That's an important component for searches. Also, if there are elections in Germany, there'll be Germans this weekend in Mexico. So I'm talking to that team uh, with a few weeks prior notice to prepare them as to the content. Seeing what we saw that was successful last year to find out if we can repeat it or innovate in some ways to do something different. And the next question, could you tell us more about how the Times is changing? I think the New York Times is changing significantly. I'm part of the BEI. This is a business equity and inclusion team. I work much more on the audience side, so my area of responsibility is to look at not only the total, the aggregate number of users or traffic, but specifically different segmented audiences. For example, people in Mexico who read us, or in Latin America generally. Not every day, but we take the pulse every now and again to see what's happening in those parts of the world. But we're also trying to adapt our coverage to be able to talk more about Hispanic communities, Afro American communities, and the global communities of people of color, we could say. And that's how the Times is changing, I think, at the same time. When we take the metrics on our audiences, there are a number of newspapers that don't have a social media strategy or a search engine optimization strategy. But at the Times, editors and reporters know that our product, and our product in Spanish, I say the newspaper's product, but it doesn't have to be the same in the digital space as it does in paper. So many, for a long time, what we would write digitally, we would include in the paper. But I think now we have a much broader digital coverage that is not included in the paper or in the print paper. We couldn't fit it in. And editors and reporters not only are writing about what they want, but they're also writing for the audiences and trying to meet the interests, the needs, and the expectations of those audiences for a specific kind of coverage. The next question is, how would you compare your experience in community journalism with the New York Times? For me, the difference is, well, when I was in community journalism, I wasn't working on the internet, right? The internet already existed, but it wasn't so advanced, or so I really was a print journalist. But as you know, the New York Times is a worldwide media company with a great deal of resources that many community newspapers will never be able to match. But what I've seen is that newspapers that I worked on before, community newspapers, now do have a digital presence, and this is very different from their presence before. Many people who might choose to read a book or even a newspaper today will do so in the online format. Next question. Do you think there's been a change in terms of mainstream newsrooms on how coverage is done? I think that is true. I think not only is it going to be important to have more journalists of color in our companies, but to think about journalists of color when you're putting together a coverage, when you think of how we're going to carry out coverage, don't think only about how this will affect one segment of the population, but all of the population. You have to have many more journalists of color. I think that's very important, maybe the most important change, but you could have the same kind of product that's not just doesn't reflect the diversity of your coverage. So what's key here is to have more people who want to talk about what the coverage is and to adapt and change what's being covered. This not only involves reporters, but people who work like I do on the audience side. When Jose Jose or Walter Mercado died, or when Nixie Hussle died, there were many people who, within the newsroom, who didn't really understand who these people were, or they might have known who they were, but they didn't understand really what the importance of those people were for the communities that we are also writing for. So that's a responsibility that I have of speaking up when I see that there are important issues for the Latino or the Latin American readership, and to speak up and say we have to cover this because it's important for an important segment in our country. And then the next question is, what can you share uh, to us about working with a community media organization? I think the most important experience of working in those kinds of newspapers was just the experience I acquired because I learned what a good story was. I at the university, I think many people begin to have an idea about this, but you really don't learn about it until you are working. So that was one of the best lessons that I learned, that there are certain things happening in any community in New York, for example, and in a large newspaper like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and many of them don't have that kind of information because they don't have that diversity represented in their company. They don't necessarily understand what's happening in their local communities. And I still see that happening today. When I go to work every day, I am not necessarily able, in the metro section that covers what's happening locally here in New York, covers uh, what's happening. But I can also point out that there are things that are not being covered by us in the metro section that are important stories for the Hispanic, for the African American community here. And the next question, in terms of investigation techniques or technology, what do you think the most important skill is for a journalist today? I think the skill set that you need is to be diverse. And I see the most successful journalists today uh, to be those journalists who are savvy about social networks, about social media. They know how to reach the audience with what they write about every day. At the same time, I think that somebody who's open to changes and understands the changes in the digital landscape that has happened, and that they're able to be present in Instagram. They can uh, write a story in Twitter that'll follow on any story that they've already done. So I think a skilled journalist is one that's able to present a story in a number of ways, and I think that's really who's successful in the digital space.
Okay, so let's see what's next. And so, besides that LinkedIn message, how did you get the opportunity to be at the New York Times? Could you talk to us about what the process was of applying and what your interviews were like? Were you surprised? Were you nervous? Well, when I got that message on LinkedIn from the New York Times, I was working at CBS. I had been there for 2 or 3 years, and I wasn't interested in leaving CBS at that time, but the New York Times is the New York Times, right? And so when I got that message from them, they wanted to talk to me about my local sales strategy because at the time I was, or sorry, SEO strategy because I was working in local SEO at that time. Well, CBS had different television stations in California, in New York, Philadelphia, etc. And there I had to put together an internet strategy for positioning in each market. when they sent that message to me, I didn't think it was for an interview, and so my second in command came with me because I thought it's not an interview. And they didn't say it was an interview. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to bring this person along who I worked with so that she could also see the New York Times. And when I went, we finished up, we spoke for about a half hour. And when I left, the person who was working with me, whose name is Samantha, she said that she didn't feel like she should have been there because she thought that they wanted to interview me about a job. And I said, no, I don't think it's like that. And then 2 weeks later, I got an email from them to interview for them for a position on their SEO team. And I remember that that was in August of 2016. And so had interviews for over 3 months, 8 interviews in total. There was an interview that we did at 7 in the morning, which is too early. And that was the year of the 2016 elections. And when I got the job, I started 1 week after our prior president won the election. And so I started at a time in which the Times as an organization changed tremendously in a lot of different ways. In terms of their operation and their writing then. And so the next question is, with the amount of information available, what new trends do you think are important to look at for managing the Times presence or visibility in the future? Well, I'm going to speak with my SEO hat on because that's what I do. What the most important thing is for us is long-term content. That's referred to as evergreen content. So there are news every day. There's live content, live briefings, live blogs, live chats, all of that, right? And so day to day, we understand how to win, how to report, but we also understand SEO in terms of our audiences. And so we understand how to win certain events every day. It could be a speech or a football game. But what we have to do now at the same time is to create content in our sections like health or science, where there might not be a lot of news day to day, but where we can create content that people are seeking out every day so that there are users who keep coming back every day. But at the same time, what I mentioned before was that we have we want to have a more diverse audience. Our audience is not diverse now, and we need to change that because it's going to be important long term for our brand. Because we live in a diverse country, and without a diverse audience, at some point, we're not going to be able to continue to grow. And the next question is, community stories in Latin America have connections to communities in the US. How can you move forward this sort of collaborative journalism through different media and platforms, and to get away from the parachute journalism paradigm or model that the Times continues to promote? I think that the most important thing, well, I think, I don't know if this is the answer you want, but we have reporters in every country, right? But at the same time, I don't think that we can cover every country the way that we would like to, right? And so those brands in whatever country have a much stronger connection with the population from that country. And so I don't think that in the future we're going to have a daily presence in any country, not just in Latin America, but what we do is we talk about the key issues when they arise. And that's our strategy right now, I think. Okay, next question. Does the New York Times hire international correspondents in Latin America whose native tongue is not English but who speak English? I think there are a lot of reporters that we have in Latin America, but so I couldn't tell you exactly because I don't have that much experience speaking to reporters in that part of the world. So I talked to the editorial team that covers our Spanish language page, but I don't know a lot about what types of reporters they hire. But if you'd like to send me a message, I can look into that and see how they view those candidates. Next question. So the next question is, how did I decide to go from being a journalist to doing SEO? So, I will be a journalist my whole life. And I think that people who work with me and for me also consider me that. And I say that because sometimes what happens in a lot of newspapers, and which is a failure for me, is that they consider people who work in audience to only be experts in that specific area. And so I'm no different from a reporter or an editor who is producing content every day, because the majority of the time now, when there is a big piece of news or when there isn't big news, I am the person and my team are the ones who are generating ideas about what these reporters should be writing about. And not only to generate metrics, because there are certain brands that are going to write about everything and they don't care about the content of the quality of that content. But for me and for my team here at the New York Times, we think that number one, we want to see if it's a good idea as far as editorial, if it's something that we haven't done before, and then we can say there's 500 people searching this or 1,000 people who are searching for this topic or this term, and what we have to change, most importantly, is that people who work in social media or who work in audience have to be considered journalists within that newsroom. So I started in SEO about 10 years ago in 2011, and I was an editor, but I didn't want to be an editor anymore. So there was somebody who was the SEO director at that company, and he said that I should make some changes to the content that I was editing. And then his recommendations helped generate more traffic to those articles. And after a month, he left the company. I was the only person who understood even the basics of SEO because they didn't understand it at that time. And then from there on, I moved into SEO, and I have stayed there for 10 years now. And I think there are a lot of people who think that SEO is something that's hard to understand or hard to do or hard to learn. And I don't think it's hard. I think for a journalist, if you have a background in journalism, it's much easier to do SEO because you understand journalism, you understand content, and you understand how to create ideas. And so an SEO job is not that different. We have about 5 minutes left. So, how do climate change stories work and their relation to human rights in Central America? Is the New York Times wanting to cover stories that are closer to the reality that people are seeing in the Southern Code? Well, I can't really speak to that because I don't have that much experience. So I work with the climate section. It's weekly. And so we're generating ideas about that, but there are so many sections that issue can touch on. That can be in the international section, that can be in the climate section. And so I think that's something that I can't say I've read things about that, but there certainly is content that we've produced about that topic. But, I think that's a better question for somebody who works in that section and who knows, how they are approaching that. Okay, next question. What do you mean by saying that the New York Times audience is not that diverse? Do you have numbers to back that up? Well, what I know is that our audience is an audience we're not reaching the entire country. So there are people who don't see themselves in the New York Times. And that's the change that we're trying to bring about as far as coverage, as far as content, so that people, when they think about the New York Times, they think that there will be news about any issue that focuses on their community. And I think that we are growing in that regard, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done, like other big newspapers here in the United States and globally at the same time. And we have 3 minutes left. If you have any other questions. Okay, well, I don't think we have any more questions. And so, like I said at the very beginning, if you would like to send me a message, if you'd like to talk about SEO, anything about digital journalism, you can write me on Twitter. You can send me an email at the New York Times or to my New York Times email address. And I appreciate the time that I've been given. And let's talk soon.